how to manage your life science suppliers like a pro. And let's get going. So, why should we care about this? It's no surprise to anyone that our modern supply chains are more complex than ever. And we all know from COVID all the challenges that we had around supply chains. So, this has become an increasing emphasis for companies to look at this. But what we'll talk about today is the fundamentals around how to manage your suppliers from a quality and risk assessment standpoint. And that's the starting point for any supply chain management. We only have to read the news in terms of the industry news regulations and rags that we all follow and updates that come in through our emails about issues that companies have almost on a daily or weekly basis. And so part of the purpose of the webinar here is to help you to avoid these kinds of issues because they can be very costly and damaging to organizations. So just some data here that's really stunning when you look at the average life science company, and this would be a large commercial type of company, has approximately 600 suppliers. And if you look at Moderna's single COVID vaccine, it's 3,000 suppliers. That's incredible. 1 in 10 of these average suppliers is a virtual company, which presents its own unique challenges. And as I mentioned, it wasn't COVID, but there's various things that are impacting supply chain disruptions. So what are some common mistakes? Again, these are some horror stories from the news that we like to share with you. In this case, an Irish company was sourcing a needle from a supplier, and as an all too common practice is that their process was altered without notifying them, and the root cause was there's no quality agreement in place, which we'll be talking about later. So a new risk was introduced from a sleeve that was breaking off in people's eyes, and you can imagine how horrific that was for the patients that received this product. So obviously that led to a multi-million-dollar recall of this product that was already out in the market, and that can be really challenging to manage a recall. A problem here was with a Botox company. Its needles were sterilized with ethylene oxide, and they changed it from radiation to ethylene oxide, which is a very toxic molecule. That's why it's effective as a sterilizing agent. So this residue caused contamination of the products, and again, potential cancer risk, but nevertheless, again, another costly recall and supplier change. This is another example with an alcohol wipe. It was contaminated with Bacillus cereus, which can cause some, no pun intended, serious infections. So again, the company was bankrupted and left customers to face liability issues. The owner was convicted on felony charges. So again, they weren't following the law in some manner, and so the FDA prosecuted them, and there are a number of cases in the industry where people actually went to jail. So you as the sponsor, and I'll assume that you're the sponsor, are ultimately responsible for quality, but the suppliers are responsible for quality as well. But you have an important role in ensuring that they are that they're compliant in their policy practices and are using good practices. So, you know, while quality agreements wouldn't have stopped the first two events, they could have stopped those if there was a quality agreement in place. And so those are fundamental. And increasingly, we see clients really starting with early phase clinical materials, they're putting those into place, which is good practice. The alcohol wipe manufacturer should have done an on-site audit. And that's where risk assessments come in. Who do you need to go on site to audit them, and who is low risk, and you probably don't do an on-site audit. But in this case, it would have revealed very dirty practices. and practices that could lead to contamination, and should have raised this issue before it became a problem. They didn't audit them because they hadn't received warning letters. Well, there's always a first, right? And you don't want to be the one who's at the receiving end of that warning letter because you didn't oversee your supplier appropriately. So the product liability lawyers are always looking for these cases, and they'll go after, again, like I said, you're responsible for quality, so they're going to go after you. They go after the deep pockets. You're liable for the weak supply chain and the issues that happened in it because, again, you're responsible for quality. So obviously, the more you outsource, the more that your safety and efficacy depends on your supply chain and your suppliers. This is a fun fact around Form 483s. For medical devices, 15% are caused by poor purchasing controls and noncompliance with the CFR. So again, this demonstrates the importance of supply chain management. So we'll talk about some top tips and best practices to create an airtight supply chain. First, it starts with quality agreements. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Deborah, to discuss this.
Thank you, James. We hope it's airtight. There's always a possibility that you have gaps, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So what is a quality agreement? I'm not a lawyer. However, I've reviewed and helped author a lot of quality agreements. And it's essentially a contract between the supplier and the customer. And notice that it says between. It's a collaborative effort. And the content of the quality agreement needs to be doable for both the supplier and the customer. You don't want something that's so onerous that everything revolves around the content of the quality agreement. On the other hand, you don't want something that's so loose that you don't cover the things that are important to your quality.
I think it's important to mention here, while it's not mandatory under the FDA 21 CFR, it is in their guidance that this is best practices. And and that's the difference, is one is the letter of the law, but one is best practices and really considered good current manufacturing practice.
So the deputy commissioner at the FDA in 2018 was at a talk about supply chain risk. And she said, she pretty much summed it up. Qualities are crucial, and being complacent and trusting your supplier blatantly can introduce massive risk into your supply chain. I recently worked with a drug sponsor, and the CEO had already picked their CMO. And he said, well, we don't have to do any audits or any qualification of them, right? Because they're a global, well-known company. That's not a good reason not to go forward with approving a supplier. And we'll talk about that a little bit later.
I'm reminded the saying from NASA, failure is not an option.
Yeah. And so there's your regulation from the FDA, 21 CFR 200.100. Contract manufacturers are extension of your own facility. And when they finish the product, who's releasing the product? The drug sponsor's releasing the product. So it's an unbroken extension. So a little analogy here. You're the gatekeeper for your suppliers and your vendors. This is services also, not just suppliers. Testing services, for instance. Your quality agreement is pretty much the design of the gate. And I have here that the failure to meet the agreement, the gate's locked. I can tell you that it's not that easy when you have a disagreement with your quality agreement to just lock the gate. It's a collaborative process that you have to work through with your supplier or your vendor. And I would say locking the gate would be one of the last steps that you go through. So what's in a quality agreement? I'm not really a fan of the word should when we're talking about quality initiatives. However, there's no absolute content that you have to have. So I guess should's okay here. Unambiguous, we'll talk about that a little bit later as far as the vocabulary that you use, and especially with multinational companies, making sure that everybody understands the words the same way. Roles and responsibilities, mandatory information exchange and how you do that. And if you have common folders in a SharePoint somewhere where you place information or track timelines, that the detail doesn't necessarily have to be in the quality agreement, but those are the kinds of things you want to think through when you're doing the quality agreement. And the other thing is, if you don't do an on-site audit, you won't see a lot of their the supplier's documentation. They won't share it with you. So that's something to keep in mind when we go forward and talk about how you assess a supplier. Clear deliverables and time frames, that's not only for the product, but also for turnaround time on things like deviations and changes, notifications. Do they give you enough time when they make a change for you to react or to analyze it and react? And again, clear definitions of all content. That's the vocabulary and the understanding of the words the same way, which sometimes you won't find out until it comes up after the quality agreement is approved.
Often attorneys that you're working with on putting this in place will be very dependent on you in terms of the content, the meaning, and what's important to you as the business sponsor. So when you read these, if they're not clear to you, don't be afraid to push back, because the language in these should be very clear and understandable by anyone who reads this contract. You don't have to be an attorney.
So Part 211 gives you a structure, or 820, to start with the parts of the reg, but you also need to look at the subparts. This is just to kind of help you determine how you're going to structure your quality agreement, but you need to look at the subparts that are relevant for the supplier or vendor that you're working with, to make sure that you cover all of the content that's important. And under general, you putting in your quality systems like change control and deviations.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, now we'd like to move on to audits. And as you heard, Deborah has tremendous experience in this.
Yeah, I would say more than what was said, actually. Okay. So give yourself the right to audit clause. I would, in the second line there, it says your company may audit the supplier. I would be more adamant than that. I would say you will audit the supplier. If you don't, that's fine. But there's that may word, may cause confusion and debate where it doesn't need to. And we'll talk about what kind of an audit you do, whether you're going to do like a survey questionnaire, whether you're going to do an on-site. Now, virtual audits are also happening as a result of COVID in most cases, and technology moving forward. So instead of saying may, I would do something else. But if you say may, I would definitely define that and let them know that it means that you're going to come in.
Yeah, this is especially true for your critical suppliers. Well, you want to have the language there where you set up some periodicity to have regular audits, and then you have something known as a for-cause audit. So if some issue happens, major issue, you have a right to come on and audit as part of that issue.
So what triggers a supplier audit? Go back to the 21 CFR 200. The suppliers are extension of your own facility and your QC lab and your reference lab and your cell banks. I added that in. So it's an extension and a representation of your mark. The examples that James gave at the beginning of things that went wrong, he talked about the financial weight on the company, but probably equally important is the bad reputation now that's associated with your company. So we have, let's see, performance anomalies. Okay, so these are things that would trigger an audit after you have approved the supplier in some cases. Regulatory guidance, patient customer feedback, other clients of the same supplier. If you see that you do your research before you approve the supplier, and risk-based audits in cadence with the critical supplier performance. But also an audit can be triggered based on your risk assessment of the supplier or the vendor and the importance of understanding their operation before you approve them, not just after they're on board. So audits can start in your system before you approve the supplier. Okay, so why do we do supplier audits? To actually just to get the overall thing that I told the CEO, who said he didn't have to do an audit because it's a global, well-renowned company with nothing in the news about them. And I said, well, one of the things is you have to get a feel for whether or not you can work with this supplier and what their operation is like. And doesn't mean that they're good or bad. It just means, are you a good fit with this company? And do they seem to have similar values and approach to quality? So think of the relationship that you have to establish. You have to establish a good relationship when everything is going well, and a better relationship when you have to work on problems. So here's a laundry list of reasons to do a supplier audit. It's all part of your risk assessment when you determine the impact of the supplier or the vendor on your product. But you can see there at number 4, foster communication and trust is a big part of it. And okay, let's go on, and then I'll come back to another in the news example. Okay, so now these for risk-based suppliers, focus efforts proportionate to the supplier's risk. So now we're going to talk about, do you have to do a full-blown multi-system audit of every supplier? No. That would take your resources and the supplier's resources and may not give you any additional advantage. You have to look at the scope of what the supplier is doing, the risk of things going wrong, and what you need to find out about that supplier on whether or not you're going to do an audit, an on-site audit. And of course, there's cost involved for both you and the supplier. A supplier hosts an audit. It's an all-day event. And I've actually audited laboratories that have so many customers that they have a whole quality group that just manages audits. And they have an audit literally every working day of the year. They have a whole system in place. So, but they have that many customers. Every company is not going to have that. I've audited medical device companies that have five employees, and an on-site audit for them is a major event. So go ahead, James.
I think one of the most important messages is that a risk-based approach focuses your limited resources on where it has the greatest impact, and therefore the greatest risk reduction for your organization.
So here's a cost example, and compliance at any cost is just what James is saying. Do you really need to put the resources in for a supplier or a vendor that's been determined to be low or medium risk? Okay, these, I don't know if you can see these. I'm going to put my glasses on to see. But this first one is required documents. So this is an example of the kind of documents that you want the supplier to have based on the criticality of the supplier's service or product. So you can see we have columns for critical, high, medium, and low. And as you go through the criticality scale, the documentation level is less. And all of your suppliers are not going to be regulated or even certified. They may be ISO 9001 certified, but remember that they're not all going to be GMP or ISO. So that kind of helps you to work on your criticality level. But if they're not GMP, then you have to decide how much emphasis you're going to be putting on their records. If they don't know GDP documentation and you have to trace things back with a deviation to their records, you have to understand what kinds of controls they have in place and whether or not that will be suffice for you to have records like that.
That's a great point, Deborah. And you and I have both experienced a supplier that had a critical component that our client needed, but they had absolutely no quality system. And we've had to go in, help remediate those companies so they'd have a foundational, basic quality practices because that component was so critical to that.
Yeah. And that's another good point, the collaborative part. Remember that you want that this is a win-win for you and your supplier. So you want to be collaborative. You don't want to be dictatorial to your supplier. If you help them, they will help you. Okay, so this is a similar list, and this is the kind of it's the kinds of audits that you might do. These timelines, I probably would change some of these timelines depending on the criticality. First of all, I would do an initial for a critical supplier or a vendor. But this is just an example of how you design your supplier management program, and you include the length of time between audits. You may or evaluations. You may decide that you want to go in sooner if there's a problem, or you may decide that you haven't found any problems and they're humming along with a really good quality system and quality product. And so you can extend the time between your on-site audits.
This is just emphasizing the critical, high and medium and low, and how that impacts the frequency of audits. But again, this is an example that we're seeing here. And as Deborah said, your organization should pick a cadence that works well for you.
One other thing about that obviously that's some sort of an electronic database. So the more that you can keep your records on your suppliers retrievable, the better. So if you're going to put in an electronic database, you want to, of course, make sure that you have your data integrity requirements in order. But look at the numbers of suppliers that some of these companies have that James showed us. To be able to retrieve information about any supplier, you could be going through manila folders, or you could be looking at a database. I think this one's yours, James.
This is some major categories of the various risk factors and buckets. And to Deborah's points, we often work with clients who are picking a contract manufacturing organization who actually have scores within each of these buckets as part of the process of screening potential CMOs. But again, then throughout your life cycle with that relationship, these are things you want to focus on. So a lot of things that come into play are, supplier location. This is increasingly an issue now for organizations. You've heard of offshoring and onshoring. The complexity of the products and really the criticality of that. Are they a loan vendor? Obviously, that increases the risk if you're completely dependent on them and there aren't alternatives. Reputational. You can find out a lot from your colleagues, from scanning the industry news and learning a lot about their reputation. A good one is regulatory. As we talked about earlier, not having none doesn't necessarily mean there aren't any. any problems. Nevertheless, an organization, especially larger ones, have been around for a while, will have a regulatory history, and this information is discoverable. But certainly, when you start engaging them, these are things you want to ask about as well, and do a deeper dive when you do an actual inspection. Financial, sometimes this can be harder to get some information on. Not all companies are public, but certainly as part of your due diligence and when you're interacting with them under CDA, this is an area you definitely want to explore too, because a company that goes out of business is definitely a risk to you as well.
So some other risks to consider. Growth. So if you're starting out with a drug product or a device and you're not at commercials yet, but you're working towards that, can your suppliers keep up with you? Can they continue to support you as you go through your phases of development? IT systems, my particular bugaboo, with technology changing so fast, a lot of companies don't really have mature, sophisticated IT systems and applications in use yet. And it's okay to have a hybrid of electronic records, which you often find with the warehouse and the materials side of the house, and analog records, hard copies, when you probably the biggest example would be the training system. So it's important for you to understand your needs as far as records are concerned and data integrity, but it's also important to understand the robustness of the IT systems with your suppliers. And if they're all forms and they're under control, that's fine. But I can tell you that I've seen many examples. One of the questions I ask on an on-site audit is, and I ask this in advance, and not once have I gotten it, is can I have a list of all of your electronic systems and your applications that you use for GMP? And most of the time, they don't even have, the IT doesn't even have the list, which you would expect them to have so that they have the name of the app, the version, the installation date, the criticality, all of that. You would expect them to have that. So I never know whether they just don't have it under control or if they don't want to share it. But that's an important thing to know with data for data integrity. Mm-hmm. Chain length, I think James checked on this. How far from your business does your chain stretch, and internationally now? And then facility changes. The quality agreement needs to have clear language in it about changes, including facility changes. I recently did an audit of a company that was providing a testing service, and the testing service quality system did not have a complaint system. Their production side of the house had a complaint system, but they had no complaint system for their test customers. And so I ended up on a conversation with their global head of quality at the end of the day to try and explain to me what they didn't have. And they had a new employee in quality that was on the call, and he blurted out, well, it doesn't matter because we're not going to be doing that test anymore in the future. So my client had hired me to go in and do a supplier audit of this company that was providing the service. And my first question was, does my client know this? So changes can happen in a company, and your quality agreement needs to be very clear about the advance notice that you need for the change. And I mean, in this case, the client now has to figure out how they're going to get this testing done. And I don't know what the outcome was because I wasn't involved with the corrective action, but that points to the fact that your suppliers and your vendors can do changes that can have immediate impact on you.
I think the slide also points out, I would also put in, if you're going to have an ongoing relationship with them, equipment and process changes. Really what we're talking about in terms of IT systems is knowledge management. Because once you have an approved product, you'll have to do your annual product review update to the agency. And as part of that package, you'll be highly dependent on a large volume of information that comes from them. So if they're disorganized and discordant, you could be getting bad information, incomplete information, but it can make your job of pulling that annual product review together much more difficult if they're not proficient in that area. Okay. So we'd like to just talk about some top tips. And, when we're saying treat your suppliers like a stock portfolio, it's about risk, right? So know where your high risk stocks are and which ones you want to monitor very closely. Diversify when you can. Certainly, it's a rule of thumb for critical suppliers to have 2+ suppliers. Typically, most organizations won't seriously look at that until they have an approved product. Then they'll start to go in and look at that redundancy. And again, this is where a risk assessment is so important. For sodium chloride, is that a high risk? Absolutely not. So if you have a single supplier for that, if something happened, you could probably very quickly find an alternate supplier. On the other hand, if your supply chain is vulnerable for multiple reasons and your company is dependent on one supplier, that's often where you want to find a secondary supplier as a backup, and then do some manufacturing with them just so that they stay interested and they stay up to speed on your process. But also consider split orders, again, to maintain minimum order requirements with that backup, again, in order to keep them up to speed and interested in your business.
So what kinds of things do we think about pre-audit? Do your research. Obviously, you can find things in the news and professional publications and other colleagues. I think a lot of us have worked with people from all different industries, and we have colleagues that we can reach out to for their experiences. Number 2, set your standards. I'd like to expand that to define your specifications. It's best to do all of this before somebody decides what supplier you want to use. And I can tell you that that's not always the case. You get somebody in your organization who's always used a supplier, somebody else, and they pick them before you even set your specifications. So for number 2, I would modify that to make sure that you define your user specifications and the critical ones and the nice to have ones. Choose carefully. When you end, I think that it would be good to have a selection board of the stakeholders to review everything that you found out as part of your process and to do the criticality assessment and the risk assessment. And as you can see under mid-audit, we've got that build a relationship again, open collaborative atmosphere. I have a story for all of these. I worked with a company in Israel that was making a small device that had a computer board on it that was having a failure. And they did the supplier corrective action back and forth. And finally, the engineer for my client went to the company manufacturing the board, walked through their process, found the place where the weld was difficult to do because of the angle, and helped them together develop a solution. So that's a collaborative effort with your supplier, and it was win-win. The board supplier could continue to sell their product, and my client had less failures on that board when they installed it. So that's a perfect example. Now, can you do that with everybody? No. Will they let you in all the time to walk through with you? No. But keep that in mind as a possibility. And then, as you see, number 4 there, we talk about the identified risk again. Okay. So some due diligence areas for onboarding. This is interesting about the website. You might want to go sometime and look at the website of big companies and see that the website is not well maintained. They have things that are upcoming events that were last year. They have links that don't work or that don't provide the information that they say they provide. So a website can tell you a lot about a company and their approach to documentation and quality. So ops, I got to put my glasses back on again. So that's your liability and your financials and your industry focus. So industry accreditation and standards, and I would add certifications. I've not looked at industry body membership as part of a supplier approval, but certainly if it's important, that would be something that you would want to see. Third-party reports. Some companies will have a third party do a general audit and then provide that to you instead of you having to go into an audit. So that's a possibility. And then, of course, the history of the company. So I'd like to, when you talk about the compliance history, in 2020, the company Emergent, that's in Baltimore, had an FDA inspection, and they had 4 observations in their 483. None of them involved cross-contamination. In 2021, many people are probably familiar that in the news, Emergent was manufacturing COVID vaccine for Johnson & Johnson, and they had a product failure related to the wrong substance being in the product. And they were also manufacturing another vaccine for another company. They had 9 observations in their 2021 FDA inspection, and many of them were for cross-contamination that was observed while the FDA was there. So if the companies that were manufacturing vaccines, especially with the gear up for COVID and the amount of effort that companies had to do to gear up, if they had even walked in there, they could have seen these cross-contamination problems. They were moving product across the floor. They weren't changing their gloves. They weren't cleaning things. Very obvious things that an auditor would have seen. And so do we have to do an on-site audit of a established company? Well, in that case, it might have helped head off a lot of problems, which ended up giving a couple of companies some bad names for their brand. And then the leadership component. How many times have they changed key positions in the last 5 years, for instance?
I'll give a tip. I was helping a client pick between 2 suppliers, and I went on, it was hard to choose. So I went on one of the employment boards, I think it was Glassdoor, and looked at the employee reviews of their own company. And it was pretty clear from that who to select.
Okay. By the way, that Emergent 483, anybody can go on the FDA website, type in Emergent, and you'll get the 483s and you'll get their responses. If you'd like to see that. I don't know if you can find the root cause information. Okay, so things to look for in a supplier audits. An audit is a snapshot in time, and you can look horizontally across many systems to get the vibe of the place, to see if they're in control. Or if you have a focused area that you're concerned about, you can look vertically and focus your audit on those things. Like you may want to focus your audit just on production and not look too much at the quality system separately. When you look at production, you will see parts of the quality system in action. So you don't want to spend a lot of time looking if they control their SOPs and have version control if the line clearance is more important to you and the prevention of cross-contamination. So you have to realize that when you do your audit, as it says here, you're getting the vibe of the place. You're trying to see, do they have an understanding of their systems, and do they have controls in place that they're actually executing correctly? And you can do this in a one-day audit. When you walk, I've found that I used to walk around right after the presentation in the morning, but I found if I look at some key SOPs, like their receiving and QC on their materials, their SOPs for production, and then packaging and labeling, before I walk around, my walk around is a little bit more informed, and I could focus my questions on what I've already seen in their SOP to see if they're executing it. And then after that, you can look at the other systems that you can look at, like a batch record and the associated records with that. The communication is important when you're looking at an audit. And again, when I ask IT if they have list of applications and systems that they use, and QA doesn't know whether they have list or not. It feels like they're operating in silos and they're not communicating across the different functional areas. Employee competence and qualification. It's interesting when I do audits, what places allow me to talk with the employees doing the job and what places the supervisor jumps in and gives me all the answers. I sense in a lot of cases that the employees know exactly what they're doing and they're capable of answering the question, but the supervisors aren't allowing that to happen. And some of the biggest problems I've seen is documentation of training and competence. If it's a hard copy system, that seems to be the record that they have the biggest problem keeping up to meet GDP and GMP requirements.
I'll tell a little story from someone that I met that ties in some of the things that Deborah just mentioned. And this gentleman was in the Navy, and his job was to go onto Navy ships and to see and audit them to see if they were compliant with policies, procedures, and SOPs of the Navy. He said he got so good at it that within the first 5 minutes, he could tell whether they were compliant or not. I scratched my head, well, how could you do that? If he came on board and they took him down to the mess hall, started giving him good food, started treating him like a king, started giving him a song and a dance, he knew they were trying to cover up, so he could tell right away whether they were compliant or not. That gets to the vibes that we were talking about here.
Yeah, that's a good point, James. I limit the opening I try to limit the opening meeting to 15 minutes, so I don't get the marketing presentation all morning from the company. Okay, so what to look for in the supplier audit? I just mentioned the warehouse operation, logistics and supply, security, product, personnel security and product security. I've walked through buildings that had limited access in certain areas and the door didn't close and it didn't engage because the lock was malfunctioning and people walked by it all day and nobody noticed it. I've seen that even happen going into a clean room where the door malfunctioned and they reported it when I identified it. Environmental health and safety and pest control is another big one. Companies hire a pest control company and put the reports in a binder on the shelf, and they never look at the reports if there are no issues. And typically a pest control company will tell you there's a gap in the door that needs to be repaired or something like that they never look at and never document that they've reviewed it and addressed the problem. Packaging, just match their SOPs to how they're packaging and holding. And their own procurement supplier management activities. So here, what you want to know is how does the approved supplier list integrate with procurement? And there's two things. Does it need to be an approved supplier? Maybe they don't need approved suppliers for their office printer paper. And is it an approved supplier and is it approved for the product or service that you're actually purchasing? So the company that I audited that was a big lab that had audits every day was a testing facility, but they also had a stability function that was a separate function. So if you approve them for the stability service, product stability service, do you automatically approve them for the testing service? Or do you go in and do a separate audit? It's your choice. But your procurement people have to understand if they're procuring for a particular product or service, or if they're procuring just because of the company that you've approved.
I'd like to throw in a little anecdote. A client of ours was visiting their critical supplier overseas, and they saw a box propping a door open to the facility. He said, hey, what's going on here? A rat could get in here. And they said, rats don't jump that high.
Oh, well, okay. So I can trump that. I was working in a facility, and one day when I left, the door was propped open with the trap. They used the trap to prop it open to let somebody's group come in after hours. So they had no idea that they had this whole pest control system and just ruined it with the visitor was the person who put the trap in the door, by the way. Okay, so what to look for in a supplier audit. So are they trained? This is the records part. And now a lot of companies will have an electronic training record system. And when you ask to see the training, they'll give you a laundry list of training, and it has the SOP or the function on it and the date. That's not good enough. You need to see the document that was generated at the time of the training, whether it be a form or an electronic system that got a signature off of the person that shows that they trained on that date on that version. Frequently in the electronic record, they have the SOP, but they don't have the version. And when you're auditing records and you see a problem, you may want to track it back and see, was this person trained on this version before they did this task? So you need to be able to see all of that information when you look at training records. And with these electronic systems, sometimes they don't give you that, and you have to ask them to please show me how you trace this back to the actual training and the supervisor determining competency. People that we talked about this before, can the employees describe their job and answer questions, or does the supervisor do it for you? Do they have adequate staffing? If you get an answer that says, well, we didn't get this done on time because we don't have enough people, then maybe they need to be not doing it. You can't, that's a resource like that is not an answer for not doing things compliant. So I talked about data integrity. As far as the process is concerned, the best would be if they had process maps, but if they don't, then they have to be able to describe the process to you. Gaps in uniformity, speed, all of those things have to do with the rigor of their processes and their quality systems. And it all leads up to the health of the supplier.
So there's a lot of industry guidance that's out there that you can find to help you in terms of how to develop your own audit programs and what type of procedures and things you want in place and how to conduct these types of audits. One little insider tip I'll give you is the FDA actually puts online some of the training material that they use to train their own inspectors, and that can be really important information for you to help you not only if you're hosting one of their inspections, but if you're going to do your own auditing of your own suppliers. Deborah, any comments on this?
Well, that was going to be my tip too. Yes, it's guidance for investigators, and they have it specific for different parts of the device and pharma. Okay, so this slide is telling you to design your audit, like I said before, to get an idea of the organization as a whole. You're not an inspector. You're not going in there looking for every error and every correction on every record. You want to get a good overview of their control and their processes and all of the things that we've discussed to look at. I have worked with auditors who will go sit in a conference room and just look at records all day and not have any idea what the operation was like. That's not what you're there for. And it's probably a day, maybe 2 days. I've done very few supplier audits that were less than 2 days, and most of them were considered gap analysis, where they actually asked me to come in and help them out. So it's a choreography that you have to design to touch as many different parts of the organization as you need to have confidence that they're going to provide a quality product or service.
Right. Quality isn't just compliance, because there's a lot more that goes into quality than just checking the check boxes. And the next slide really speaks to that. Is you really, it's a holistic exercise. Again, those relationships are important, because at the end of the day, you know, if they're going to go the extra mile or do something to really focus on your needs, if they value you and value the relationship they have with you, that is of untold value.
And something that we didn't discuss, but it's qualifying your auditors. you want to make sure that your auditors understand what your focus is and what your deliverable is. And so you need to make sure that your auditors understand not to go in. They're not inspecting. They're not doing a regulatory inspection. They're doing a snapshot of the operation. So think about qualifying your auditors as well.
And this is just a wrap-up slide. The theme around developing that collaborative relationship that you have with your suppliers is so important so that both parties benefit from it. Deborah, any more you want to add on the importance of this? But this is really one of the most important points that we need to make on our webinar today.
Yeah. And then what? The next slide. So the closeout meeting, I usually schedule 15 minutes. Everything, the key people that you've worked with need to know what's coming before the closeout meeting. You need to give them a quick synopsis of what's coming so they're not surprised when their senior executives show up at the meeting. But it's just 15 minutes. It's to deliver the high-level observations, if there are any, and the next steps, and to get somebody to take responsibility for following up. Then you have the report and the corrective action plan. And how quickly the supplier responds tells you a lot is true, but you need to be understanding and flexible if they communicate with you that they have more to work on. What's more important is the response saying, we're going to do something or we did something to address these observations. And if it's we're going to do something, then you've got to decide how you want to follow up. Do you want to wait till the next cycle for on-site audits? Or is it something that you really want to see that they followed through on their corrective action? And then at some point you close it in your records and determine whether or not you continue to use the supplier on the normal monitoring schedule.
This is also important information for those annual product reviews that you have as well. So you want to review these as part of that review. Okay. Now let's talk about metrics and data. And this is the ongoing relationship that you have.
So you want to make sure that you have some way of capturing information about your suppliers and vendors throughout the year. And you want to make sure that the stakeholders know to report to whoever's capturing the information when they have a positive or a negative experience. If it has to do with delivery times or if it has to do with QC of the product, you want to make sure that you can capture all of that and start a folder on each supplier so that you can monitor them and, if necessary, speed up your on-site audit, or at the end of the year, you just do a review and say, yep, we're good. We don't have to make any changes. And of course, any changes that they've made throughout the year, any deviations, all of that goes into that folder.
And again, you need your own systems to be monitoring this and capturing this information.
Yeah.
And this is really the theme of this slide here. But also quality goes beyond. It's not just a compliance checkbox, right? Quality is also the impact that it could have on, for example, your ability to supply your patients. That's also an important FDA consideration now. There's guidance out there on time, but you can often get an assessment of the risk of a stock out or supply chain by monitoring other metrics around your operations that aren't something that are strictly within the CFR that could impact your quality as well. So again, look at quality holistically, more from a Deming standpoint as well, and have the metrics to be able to monitor the type of performance that could indicate underlying problems. And those underlying problems could be deeper quality issues as well.
So we saw the two slides that had the list of documents that you would expect to see and the type of audit or the scope of audit. Additionally, your supplier management system needs to have all of these things as key parts of the system. Now, I talked a little bit about starting a folder. And so you have your initial information that you need to do to start it and to review the supplier for approval. And then you have the ongoing reports and the long-term information and especially any changes. That's an important thing for you, as James showed in his examples. So this says give yourself a mechanism of quick, easy supplier data access, which I've kind of already talked about. When for the ongoing monitoring, it's important for the QA group, but it's also important when an auditor or regulatory agency comes in. You don't want to be flailing around trying to find all these pieces of information about the supplier. And as I said, it's important for procurement to know what their boundaries are, what they can order from a particular supplier.
So let's talk about SOPs.
Okay. So remember that the regulations tell you what you have to have. They don't tell you how to get there. So your procedures, your documentation, your policies, your work instructions tell you how to get there. And so that's what you're looking for your QMS SOPs, and that's what you're looking for your supplier. I can tell you that a lot of places mix up their policy and their procedure. So if you're looking at procedures on how to receive materials or how to do an assay in a lab, and there's a lot of policy statements in there, subjective statements, and there's not a step 1, step 2, do this, do that, go get this, then you've got some issues to determine, are you going to put policies in a policy manual and procedures in a procedure manual? Are you going to have both in the SOP? Those are things that you want to decide on and make sure that your SOPs are not something that somebody wrote to put on the shelf to be reviewed, but they actually can be executed. So these are the 6 most common things that you would want for your QMS, for your SOPs, but there can be other things also.
I would ask your risk management procedures and SOPs, because that impacts everything, not only your suppliers, how you manage them, but across your organization. And risk management isn't doing a FMEA. It's something that permeates all aspects of your quality operations. And this is one of the most critical areas to apply risk management.
And I would also put training in here also.
Okay. Well, time flies. This is the end of our presentation part, and now the really fun part starts, is with the Q&A session.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Deborah and James. This was a fantastic presentation. I learned a lot within the last hour or so. So I have a lot of great questions. We have a fantastic group that was really diligent in asking some great things. So I'm going to jump right into the Q&A. And as a reminder, if we don't get to your question, we will be sending everything via email in the next 7 business days. So any questions can be sent to Qualio or the Windshire group with Deborah and James. So the first question, I'm going to start all the way from the beginning, is which regulatory guideline is published for supplier management for pharmaceutical? Are there any standard procedures to assign to the supplier?
Guideline. I'm not sure. I would have to go research that. I can do that.
Well, the FDA has guidance on it, and we showed some examples of a number of other potential sources that someone could use. I didn't quite understand the SOP part of that question. I mean, certainly they have their own SOPs for their own operations, and they need to have those. So I didn't quite understand that question. Deborah, did you understand?
I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Would you like me to read it again?
Please.
Sure. Which regulatory guideline is published for supplier management for pharmaceuticals?
Well, the second part.
And then it says, is there any standard procedure to assess the supplier?
Oh, got it.
Okay. No, that's one of those, the reg doesn't tell you how to do it. So take the information from our presentation and start to develop your procedure based on that, and then customize it for your stakeholders and your needs.
Yeah, I would also start with the guidance that we saw earlier in the presentation as a starting point for that type of information.
Great. The next question is there any requirement to raise change control for changing or adding the removal of any supplier?
I would say that that is a reflection of your change control process. It's a good idea to put it in your change control process, but you also could build that into your supplier management SOP.
And based on risk assessment.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, a critical supplier, if you have a CMO, is a CMO. I can tell you, changing the manufacturing site is one of the biggest changes out there that the FDA, I mean, that's going to go under change control under any circumstance, but there's always a gradation down. I use sodium chloride as the other example. That's probably not in your system. That'd probably be considered very low risk. That probably wouldn't qualify as a change control or be a very perfunctory exercise where it's just documented somewhere. It's part of the change control management. So it's a gradation of everything in between. And so, yes, it's important to take that and somehow at some level, I think, incorporate that into your system.
Yeah, and I would definitely document it if it's part of your supplier management system, and you can have a section of that says for low criticality items, this is how we make the change, essentially. Mm-hmm. And because you also need to make sure that the procurement arm gets that change. So you have to have a process in place, even if it's a low criticality, but you could write it into that process, the management process.
Great. The next question is, would you advise rating your supplier in terms of service that they deliver to your company and share the score with them?
That's an interesting question. I mean, certainly when you do the audits, you have the closeout and you get your observations. That sounds like, I think part of the answer to that is assessing if they know that information, what do you expect them to do? You're reducing something down to a score, but we talked about that relationship. Is that score really that important to share with it? Or is it the content behind that score and how you got to that score and dealing and interacting and collaborating with them on those aspects that gave them a particular score? I think that's what's important. It sounds like if the focus or emphasis was on a score, that makes a relationship sound a little transactional to me. So, I don't want to weigh in yes or no on a question like that, but I certainly would focus on the content behind the score and the collaborative relationship. Deborah?
And just to be clear, for service, there's different kinds of service. If it's a product, there's delivery, quality of the packaging, those kinds of things. But if it's a service, they're doing a laboratory test or a cell bank for you, then that's a different kind of question. And I agree with James. I don't, in the spirit of collaborating and having win-win for each, I don't think a score, if you get to the point where you have a score and you want to share it, you've already passed the point where you have issues that you want to deal with them.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what is your recommendation on re-auditing? And they have an example. For example, there was an initial on-site audit. Some minor findings were found, but because it is a supplier critical to quality, should we re-audit? And what would the suggested frequency be?
Well, first of all, you have to look at their corrective action plan and what they have told you and whether that's satisfactory or not. If the minor, I'm trying to compare a minor observation with impact on your product or your service. If it's minor and their corrective action looks like they understood the problem and they've dealt with it, then I would re-audit. If you're auditing them on site, you have a re-audit schedule. So you probably can keep them on the re-audit schedule. I don't know. You may want to ask an effectiveness check for their corrective action and then make the decision after you get that.
It sounded like there was a relatively low level issue, but it was a recurring thing. The fact that it's recurring can itself make it a larger or more important issue. So I would definitely take that into consideration. But you also want to make sure that organizations and the organization that Deborah referred to as a large, well-known CMO to the industry, that they don't take things that are really majors and are making them minors so that they can just sort of dispatch of them. It's a common problem in the industry. So I'd really also look at the content of those, and definitely if these things really rise to something that have the potential to impact product quality, then you're starting to get to the point where you may need to go back for a recurring issue and re-audit them.
Let me touch on those two issues. So if it's a minor that's recurring, then your management system is best served if you change that to a major because it's recurring. Mm-hmm. So that's how you handle that. As far as the company that had minor deviations, that's goes back to the quality agreement, where they can let you know they had minors, but you don't have follow-up with them. And that's one of those areas of the quality agreement that is very difficult to define and enforce. And with this big company, it was a big problem because they had great investigations, but really bad root cause analysis. And I asked them if they were trending all of these deviations that seemed to be missed by quality, like are they looking at missed reviews? And they said no. So that's a big deal that you have with your CMO, that you can't come to consensus on how the deviations are handled and root causes are handled. And I know that they made the deviation a minor because then they didn't have to share what they were doing about it with the client.
I'd be aware of any quality agreement that didn't allow you at some point to see the minors, and not just during an audit, but if they're manufacturing a lot for you, the minors associated with your lot should be visible to you, and you shouldn't get those right before you have to do batch release and you're under pressure to release that batch. That's often what CMOs will do. They know that you're against the wall. They will leverage that to the hilt and have that pressure on you. Always push to get that information as soon as you can from that organization so you have time to deal with it.
That's a good point, James. The other part of that is they give you a notification that we have a deviation, and they give you the title of the deviation. And then you wait for 5 or 6 or 7 days while they're doing their thing. And then you get the report and they say, well, we need this right away because we have a timeline. So that be aware of that also, and how you're going to work through that with them.
So going into, I guess, a little bit more clarification with those answers that you provided. The next question is, can you please give more clarification on remote or doc review requirements for suppliers qualification?
Yeah, again, the FDA just came out with guidance on this because this became increasingly important. So I would definitely start there. Again, it goes back to risk management. But just because something's high risk, I'm not saying you avoid those, because it lowers the threshold of being able to develop that interactive relationship with your client and makes it easier. I'd really look at that also as opportunities to increase your frequency of interaction with your supplier in a collaborative type of fashion. I mean, that would just be some high level input on that. But I know you've experienced those, Deborah, so I'm interested in getting your perspective.
So I've done some remote audits where they have provided a SharePoint folder or some controlled folder where they've put the documents in there and scanned records in and put them in there. The best situation is when they do it in advance. You send them a list of what your needs are, and they do it in advance. Sometimes they do it the same day, and that's kind of it's really a resource issue. I mean, you're really under fire to get a lot done. And I personally prefer if they have hard copies, to be able to review them, because I can go from one book to another while things are happening. But it works. I've also had them use their phone to walk around and give me a tour. And I've actually had companies that had multiple buildings, and they were set up so when one was finished, the other person picked up on their phone, and it was very effective. I've also did a remote that was 50 miles from my house, but they wouldn't let me come in. And they said there would be a video, and I misunderstood that was going to be a walk around with a camera, but it was a movie showing me how the person pipetted into the plates and put it. So again, you have to be clear, but yeah, it's not ideal, but I've done, I think, thorough supplier audits remotely. And that's different than the questionnaire that they fill out and that you start with that has your quality and company questions on it.
I think this is an area now that you're going to see becoming part of quality agreements now, and understanding the relationship between those and on-site visits and how those are used. But I would consider it the ideal situation is that it's an additional tool in your toolbox, and not being completely reliant on that. And also have a combination for your critical suppliers as to do the on-sites and the virtuals. I wouldn't want to be wholly dependent on it. But again, I think it'd be a great supplemental tool.
Yeah, like an on-site for like a CMO to begin with. Mm-hmm. And then depending on your experience there and your confidence, then you can maybe do remotes.
So it might be something companies want to increasingly look at as part of their selection of their supplier, how that's handled and how they're set up to do that.
But I can tell you that this company that we had problems with would not show us their deviation SOP so that we could see their categories of minor and major. Had we been on site, we could have looked at it, but they wouldn't show it to us.
And that's common.
Yeah. So those are all things you take into consideration when you decide to go on site or not.
And that's actually a perfect segue to the next question that James just mentioned about quality agreements. And a few questions actually are asking, what are some key points that should be included in all quality agreements?
I think we definitely touched one on the deviations. It's one of my pet peeve areas. And you having, Deborah and I just talked about this last night. You know, they'll push you for sign off and approval of criticals. You know, my preference would be to push for approval of anything that has direct impact on your product, right? So there could be other ones within the facility that happened elsewhere that you know, had the potential to impact your product, but it's really low level risk to your product, right? But there are things that definitely, for example, when you're manufacturing your lot, that definitely can impact your product quality. I would try to look for approval of those things.
Definitely define the roles and responsibilities. Who's reviewing the product? Who's releasing the product? Absolutely change control and the parameters around notification and response. You can't have a change control that's a week away if it's an important part of the production.
And often you'll see those roles and responsibilities in a matrix, and that's fine, but just make sure you go over that matrix and you have a clear understanding of what's meant. And if you're not clear, have that conversation with them. Well, what does this check here actually mean in reality? It's easy to sort of think you understand it when you see a check in a table, but really understand what that means in practice.
That goes back to what I said about making sure that the words in there are, everyone agrees the definitions of those words. Another example is that the company made a mistake on the C of A of a significant field, and they just wanted to put an addendum to the C of A that said we made a mistake. And my client said, no, I want a new C of A. That happened 3 times because they made 3 mistakes. And the company did not want to do a new C of A because they said, well, that's not our process. We just make an addendum. But my client held firm, but none of that was really covered in the quality agreement, but she held firm.
I think a big area is understanding their risk classifications. We've touched on this, but it applies beyond deviations. It impacts everything. Their quality system isn't going to be identical to yours, but you need to understand what theirs is and what that gap is and where those friction points are most likely to be, and see if you can account for those somehow or elsewhere in the quality agreement.
The other thing is that a lot of these drug sponsors do not have a huge quality staff. So we've run into issues with who's signing for quality on the drug sponsor side. So if you have a small staff with multiple hats, that's one of those things that they will need in the quality agreement that your supplier is going to need. And so that's something that you have to sort out before you sign off on it.
Sounds to me like we need to really build a culture of quality, and communication is key from everything you've been saying. So we have time for one more question, and then I'm going to pass it over to the Qualistry team. So we're coming up on about 4 minutes remaining. So the final question that I have for James and Deborah is, where can I find an audit checklist for CDMO? Any recommendations when qualifying and auditing a CDMO?
I have plenty of checklists, but they're all they're all structured for the particular regulation or standard that you're using. I mean, I have them for pharma, device, and cosmetics, as it turns out. But you really want your checklist to be relevant to the standards and regulations and requirements that you're using. And typically, you'll prioritize what's important for the audit. You can just put a check mark or whatever. We must look at these things. We'll look at these other things if we have time.
Deborah, does the FDA training manual that we both referenced earlier, does that have something or something could be used to develop a checklist? It's been a while since I've looked at it.
I think you could develop a checklist based on the headings, depending on the type of device or pharma, whichever guideline or investigators guideline. Sure, you could do that, but you really just go through remember one of the slides had the subparts of the reg, and that's where you start with your audits, and then you look at the additional subparts. So that's a good place to start.
You can Google and find some good material to start that process.
Yeah.
Might be good for Qualio to put out some content around that. So that's some great questions.
and some people want an answer on every row. So if it's compliant, you have to put what you saw, and if it's not compliant, you have to put what you saw.
Or not applicable.
Yeah, and some people just, if it's compliant, you put a check mark. So again, those are the decisions that you have to make of what information you want to have in your records.
Great. And actually, I lied. I have one more question that just came in the nick of time that I think is really imperative to ask. Should quality agreements come first before the audit? And that will be the final question.
It depends what audit you're talking about. I think for a critical supplier, you should have an audit, as Deborah mentioned, before you establish the relationship with them. But others that won't happen. They won't be as critical. In which case, Deborah, what are your thoughts there?
Certainly before they're manufactured, you're buying anything from them. Certainly before that. It depends on the vibe that you get to collaborate with them. If you think that the quality agreement can come after the audit or before, I mean, you might find advantage of doing it after the audit because you've been on site and it helps you to clarify terminology that they use. So that would be a help.
Sure. It's not a hard answer. I say for a critical supplier, you probably want to get on site as quickly as possible. That can help guide the quality agreement for critical suppliers.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that answer, and a fantastic question and answer session and a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much again, Deborah and James from the Windshire Group, and I'm going to pass it over to the Qualistry team.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending. It was nice meeting you all. You will receive the copy of the slides, recording, and the certificate of attendance via email within 7 working days. And also thank you for James and Deborah for the great presentation. Also thank you Qualio for the event sponsorship. Hope you had a great day or evening ahead of you. See you at our next event, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.